The clock in the Weasley kitchen had 9 hands, and Harry had spent 3 days learning not to stare at it. Each hand bore a name. Each moved between positions: home, work, school, lost, mortal peril, with the casual certainty of something that had no reason to lie. In the evenings, when the house was loudest and the kitchen was the warmest place in England, Harry would catch himself watching the hand that said "Harry" and find it resting, placidly, on mortal peril, as a kind of habit. Or perhaps because whoever had enchanted the clock had decided that was simply where it belonged. He'd been here since August 1st, since the morning after his birthday, when Mr. Weasley had collected him via the Dursley fireplace, and Aunt Petunia had pressed herself against the far wall as though proximity to a wizard might be contagious. Harry had arrived at the Burrow coated in soot, with the absolute certainty that this was the best place on earth. He still believed that. Mostly. The evenings were easier than the mornings. In the evenings there was dinner, and Fred and George doing something at least mildly prohibited somewhere upstairs, and Ginny turning the wireless up past the point Mrs. Weasley tolerated, and Mrs. Weasley herself performing the particular brand of controlled fury that was really just love organized into tasks. Harry fit into it without effort. He'd had practice, over the years, at fitting into things, at occupying space without drawing the wrong kind of notice. But in the mornings, alone in Ron's room before the house woke up, he noticed things. He noticed that when he reached for something, not with his hand, but with the other part of him, the part that had crackled and sparked its way through his childhood before he had a name for it, nothing answered. The magic was there. He could feel the shape of it, the warmth. But between the wanting and the doing was something he had no word for. A thinness, a membrane, as though someone had drawn gauze across a window and called it glass. He hadn't told Ron. He hadn't told anyone. He was fairly sure it was just him. Bill Weasley arrived on the 3rd of August, with his hair in a ponytail and a dragon fang earring catching the afternoon light, and the house reacted to him the way it reacts to a favorite relative. Everyone was slightly louder, slightly warmer, slightly more themselves within 5 minutes of him walking through the door. He was 22, and moved like someone who had spent years being competent in remote places and had long since run out of reasons to be nervous. Taller than Percy, broader than Charlie. His Gringotts robes were folded under one arm, and he greeted his mother with a hug that lasted long enough to count, and Ron by ruffling his hair in a way that made Ron duck and mutter. Charlie arrived an hour later, smelling of smoke and something earthier, and the kitchen officially reached capacity. Harry shook Bill's hand in the general noise of hellos, and Bill shook it back, and that was all. Standard. Unremarkable. Except that the grip held for perhaps half a second longer than necessary. Nothing in Bill's face changed. He released Harry's hand and moved on to clapping George on the shoulder, producing something wrapped in linen from his jacket pocket for Ginny, asking Charlie about the Romanian breeding program. Harry thought nothing of it. He watched Bill through dinner. Not with any particular intention. Harry had learned, in the years before Hogwarts, how to watch people without appearing to, but with the sideways, unfocused attention of someone quietly taking stock. Bill was listening to his mother while simultaneously tracking 3 other conversations and passing the bread to Fred without looking. Efficient, methodical beneath the easy manner. The eyes of someone whose actual job was noticing things. Once or twice, those eyes came back to Harry. It was the same look he gave the bread when he reached for it. Not unfriendly, just assessing. Then the salt. It happened in a lull between conversations, when most of the table had moved from talking to eating. The salt was at the far end, past George's elbow, and the natural response, the instinctive one, The habit he hadn't even been aware he had until it failed him was to nudge it toward himself without reaching, the way you lean a door shut with your shoulder without thinking about leaning. Nothing. The salt sat where it was. George's elbow was undisturbed. Harry put out his hand and retrieved it the long way, and no one saw, or if they did, they said nothing, and the lull folded over the moment like water. He didn't look at Bill, but he felt, without quite being able to explain the sensation, that Bill had looked at him. The garden was dark by the time the washing up was done. Harry had drifted outside through the back door for no particular reason beyond the habit of it. He'd grown up without much space of his own, and somewhere along the way, solitude had become a reflex before it was a choice. He was sitting on the low stone wall near the garden gate when Bill came out. "Mind if I—" Bill gestured at the wall. Harry moved over. Bill sat with his elbows on his knees, wand loosely held between two fingers. He looked out at the dark garden, the way a person looks at something they've been thinking about for a while. "You know what I'd do," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Gringotts, Cursebreaker." "Egypt," Harry said. "Egypt." Bill turned the wand slowly. "Old tombs, mostly. The protections on them are layered. Centuries of enchantments, one on top of the other. Part of the work is just reading them. They're not always hostile. Sometimes they're simply there, accumulated. A pause. It takes a particular kind of attention. I've developed a detection method, adapted from standard diagnostic spells. Not something Gringotts teaches. Something you build on the job out of necessity." He glanced at Harry. "It isn't standard practice. I want to be honest about that. But I'd like to use it on you, if you're willing." Most adults, in his experience, arrived at difficult things sideways, phrasing and reframing, offering versions of choices that weren't really choices. Bill was just asking. "All right," Harry said. He didn't realize, until the word was already out, that he'd been waiting for someone to ask. The scan lasted 11 minutes. Bill's hands moved in slow arcs with his wand, and the garden held still around them, and the weight of professional focus settled over the work like a second skin. He had expected, on some level, to find something. The handshake had registered as a signal, and the salt had confirmed it. This boy was not running at capacity, and the reason was not simply that he was 14. He had expected one or two workings, a ministry administrative charm, a protective measure from whatever had happened to his parents. He found layers, protective enchantments, yes, deep and ancient, and clearly not ministry origin, an administrative tracking charm, and then, below those, something that made his hands slow and careful in the way his hands went slow and careful when he found an artifact that he wasn't sure was safe to touch, a dark residue, an embedded fragment that hummed with origin signature he'd only ever seen on cursed objects. And 9, he counted twice, 9 separate bindings whose function was not protective, not administrative, not the residue of anything. They were structured restriction, capping something, holding something down, and at the very bottom, cold and purposeful in a way that had no place inside a living person at all. A tether. Bill lowered his wand. The garden was very quiet. "I need to check my references," he said. His voice came out even. He was glad. "Give me tonight." Harry nodded. He was watching Bill's face with green eyes that were, Bill noticed, already understanding something. Bill looked at him, at this quiet, watchful 14-year-old sitting on a garden wall in the dark, who had just agreed without hesitation to be read by a near stranger, because no one had ever thought to ask his permission about anything. And then he said nothing else, and turned and walked back toward the house. The back door opened. The noise of the kitchen rushed out briefly, warm and ordinary, full of the sounds of his family. Then the door closed, and the garden was quiet again. Harry sat alone in the dark. He thought about the salt. He thought about the thinness behind his sternum, the gauze across the glass. He thought about the expression on Bill's face when he'd lowered his wand. Not alarmed, not horrified, but carefully, deliberately neutral. The way a person's face goes when they are choosing very consciously not to react. He didn't know what Bill had found. But he understood, in the way you understand things before you have words for them, that whatever the Weasley family had believed about Albus Dumbledore before this evening was about to change. Bill's childhood bedroom was smaller than he remembered. The Gringotts reference materials he'd arranged on the desk, rolled parchment, a worn classification manual, 3 personal notebooks with their margins crowded in his own cramped handwriting, left no room on the surface for anything else, which suited him. He worked by wandlight. The house was quiet in the particular way it is at 2 in the morning, when even the sounds that usually don't stop had stopped. He began with what he knew. The first layer was ancient magic, not ministry origin, not deliberate in the way a placed spell is deliberate, but the residual mark of something involuntary and immense, a sacrificial act. He'd seen the signature of deep protective magic on Egyptian funerary objects before. This was older and fiercer, and it had fastened itself to the boy at the moment it was invoked. He noted it and moved on. The second was administrative. The trace, ministry standard, placed on all underage witches and wizards by law. Expected. He moved on. The third was where his pen slowed. Protective in function, yes. But this one had been placed, deliberately, by someone who understood blood-based magic at a level Bill found himself wanting to call architectural. It had channeled the sacrificial protection from the first layer and routed it through a living conduit, a blood relative, in a way that was not improvised and not simple, and bore the unmistakable fingerprint of someone who had been practicing magic for longer than Bill had been alive. He didn't write the name yet. He wrote, "Authoritative origin, most powerful wizard in Britain." And then he moved on, because if he stayed on the third layer too long, he'd stop being able to work. The fourth was expected, and unpleasant. Killing curse residue, the scar's magical component, the physical imprint of a spell that had rebounded and left its mark. It sat on Harry the way a brand sits, permanent, clear, nobody's fault, except the person who had cast it. The fifth made him put down his pen. He'd worked in Egypt for 3 years, and he knew what an object soul binding looked like. He'd excavated artifacts that carried pieces of dead wizards' identities, intent sealed into stone and gold, the magical residue of a person compressed into something that was not them. He had never seen one inside a living person. But this, a borrowed faculty, parseltongue, attached to something that was manifestly not Harry's own soul, this was the same category of magic. An object soul binding, applied to a 14-year-old boy who didn't know it was there. He wrote, "Foreign ability, enemy adjacent, soul fragment, non-Harry origin." He drew a box around it and moved on. The sixth he left last, because it was the one he understood least and feared most. Not protective, not administrative, not the residue of anything. A tether, cold, purposeful, running from Harry toward something or someone at the other end, and it did not run in one direction. He had seen analogues in funerary curses, in the bonds between certain Egyptian artifacts and the objects they were paired with. He had no name for what it was doing inside a living person. He wrote, "Dark tether, unclassified, most alarming, priority 1, and then, in a separate column, the 9. He sat with them for a long time. Origin unknown, function clear, restriction. They had been placed in early childhood. The layering had the ring of growth about it, the way a tree grows around a nail, accommodating what it cannot remove. And they had been accumulating since then. And they were not ministry origin. And they were not enemy origin. And they were not accidental. They were the most deliberate workings on the entire list. They had no protective function, no administrative function. They capped, they suppressed, they held something down and kept it there, patiently, for years. He did not write who had placed them. He didn't know for certain. He sat very still for a long time, and then he closed the notebook. Arthur was already awake when Bill came downstairs, or close enough to it, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug going cold and the same look on his face that men have when they haven't slept and are not going to admit it. Bill set his notes on the table and remained standing and said, quietly, "Dad, I need to show you something." He walked Arthur through the categories. Arthur was a ministry man and methodical even before the sun came up, and his face moved through professional skepticism as Bill spoke. The trace he confirmed without comment, the bond of blood he identified before Bill named it, his expression shifting in a way that told Bill this wasn't entirely new territory for him. Then the 9. Arthur's face did something Bill had never seen it do. Something moved behind his eyes, and then closed off entirely, becoming very still, and he reached up and took off his glasses and set them on the kitchen table. The gesture was so uncharacteristically deliberate, so unlike the easy distractibility that was Arthur's ordinary mode, that Bill felt the hairs stand up along his forearms. "Who?" his father said. "I don't know yet," Bill said. "Not for certain." Arthur nodded once. He put his glasses back on. "Tell your mother." Molly listened from the doorway of the kitchen for the first 30 seconds, and then came in and sat down at the table, without being asked, and she did not interrupt. And when Bill finished, she said, "He didn't know. Harry didn't know any of this was there." "No," Bill said. "None of it." She was quiet. Then she stood and filled the kettle. That was the Weasley way of saying, "The shock has had its moment. We are moving now." By 8 o'clock, Charlie was up. Charlie was practical in the way of someone who had spent years handling dragons. He processed danger by asking what could be done. "Is any of it dangerous?" he said. "The dark tether especially," Bill said. Charlie looked through the kitchen window at the garden, where Harry was visible doing nothing in particular near the wall, and said, "What do you need from me?" Fred and George were told nothing specific, only that Harry needed the morning to himself, and they were to be decent about it. They were, which cost them something. Ginny was in the kitchen doorway when Bill came back through. She was 12 years old, and she had heard enough to understand the shape of it. She didn't ask. She went back upstairs. Ron was told briefly, without detail, in the corridor outside his room. "Something's been found. It belongs to Harry. Give him room to come to you." Ron said, "Is he okay?" Bill said, "Not yet." The garden wall was the same wall. The morning was cooler than the night had been, and the grass was still wet. Harry was already sitting when Bill came out, his arms on his knees, looking at the garden the way you look at something when you are not really looking at anything. Bill did not soften it. 17, he said, and he went through the list. He named the sacrificial protection, ancient magic, his mother's, involuntary, and the trace, and the bond of blood. He said, "That one was placed deliberately. The construction is Albus Dumbledore's." He watched Harry's face, and Harry's face didn't move, so he continued. "The killing curse, residue in the scar, the soul fragment, and the borrowed parcel tongue, and the dark tether, which he described as an object-soul binding analogue of unknown origin and unknown destination, and which he told Harry was the most alarming thing on the list. Then the 9 he could not yet classify. "I'm calling those unexplained irregularities under active investigation," he said. "I know what they do. They restrict. I don't know enough yet to tell you who placed them or why." That was the truth. It wasn't all of the truth, but it was what he could prove. And Bill had learned in 3 years of field work that you didn't tell people things you couldn't stand behind. Harry looked at the garden for a long moment. Then he said, 17. "Yes," Bill said. "Right." Harry nodded, very slightly. "Okay." Bill went back inside. He left Harry with it, because there was nothing else to give him at the moment, and some things had to be sat with before they could be spoken. Harry sat in the garden for a long time. He tried to count the shape of his own life against the number. The years before Hogwarts, when his magic came in fits and sparks and startled him as much as anyone, he'd been told it was uncontrolled, undisciplined, a problem. The years since, being told he was remarkable. Somewhere between uncontrolled and remarkable, 17 things had been sitting in his skin without his knowledge or his consent, and he had not known, and no one had told him. He didn't cry. He got very quiet. Ron came out eventually. He didn't say anything. He sat down on the wall beside Harry, leaving a foot of space between them, and looked at the garden. He stayed for a long time, and he didn't ask any questions, because Ron was 14, and he already understood that some things cannot be made better, only kept company. That was enough. For now, that was enough. The World Cup was everything Harry had ever imagined a wizarding event could be, and the imagining had not come close. Bill watched him take it in. He'd been watching Harry for the better part of 3 weeks now, in the specific, attentive way of someone who has found a discrepancy in an artifact and cannot stop noticing it. And Harry at the World Cup was not the same as Harry at the Burrow. Here the suppression was visible, if you knew what to look for. The boy's magic, ordinarily held so far below its natural level that Bill sometimes forgot it was there at all, surged in response to the scale of it. All those witches and wizards in one place, all that accumulated magical charge, and something in Harry reached for it like a plant reaching for light, involuntary, straining against whatever held it back. Bill stood close and said nothing. The Diggories were there, Cedric and his father, which was no surprise. They were neighbours, and the Weasleys and the Diggories had shared a port key for the walk up to the campsite. Cedric was 17, broad-shouldered, easy in the crowd in the way of someone who had never had reason to be otherwise. He and Harry exchanged a brief, cordial nod. They didn't know each other well. That would change, Bill understood, in the months ahead, though he did not yet know in what direction. He put the thought away and watched the match. Ireland won. The night was spectacular and enormous and full of sound, and for a few hours it was simple, and Harry laughed at something Ron said, and Bill thought, good, let him have this. The tents were still and dark when the screaming started. It came from the direction of the Muggle family quarters first, and then it spread, and then there was fire. Bill was on his feet and had his wand out before his eyes were fully adjusted to the dark, and the first thing he processed was Harry, standing outside the tent, face upturned, not frightened in the normal way, but held, arrested, like someone who has heard a sound they cannot place. The scar. Bill crossed the distance between them in seconds. "With me," he said, and he took Harry by the arm and moved them away from the campsite and into the tree line, and Harry went without protest, which told Bill something about how much the scar was hurting. Harry Potter, in ordinary circumstances, did not go anywhere without protest. Behind them, above the tree line, the thing rose. Bill had heard of it. Every witch and wizard of his generation had heard of it, the way you hear of things that have not happened in 13 years, but have not been forgotten either. The dark mark, a skull of green fire with a serpent writhing from its mouth, hanging over the campsite like something that had been waiting to return. It was the first time it had appeared since before Harry was born. The sight of it produced a sound from the crowd below that Bill had never heard before, and hoped never to hear again. A single collective exhalation, not a scream, just breath going out of 1,000 people at once. He kept moving. Under his hand, Harry's arm was rigid. He could feel the tremor. "It's your scar," Bill said. It was not a question. "Yes," Harry said, through his teeth. Bill knew what the scar was. He'd classified it. Killing curse residue, magical imprint, Category 4, expected. What he had not expected, what he felt now through Harry's arm, through the proximity of his own curse-reading instincts, was the tether. The 6th working. The one he'd drawn a box around and labelled most alarming. It wasn't the scar that was responding. The scar was the symptom. It was the tether that had come alive, pulling taut in a way that registered to Bill as a vibration in the air, as though something at the other end had turned to look. He was not afraid of the Death Eaters on the campsite. He was afraid of that. They made it to the others. Arthur and Molly, Charlie, the rest, all accounted for, all shaken. The forest closed around them, and the noise from the campsite grew muffled. And eventually they were back on the road. And eventually they were home. The Burrow had never felt smaller. Percy was awake when they arrived, and immediately insufferable about it, with the particular brand of self-important anxiety that Percy deployed in moments of crisis. His ministry trainee opinions about magical regulation flying before anyone had put down their coats. The twins were quiet, which was stranger. Ron sat at the kitchen table and didn't touch his tea. Bill waited until the house had done what houses do, absorbed the shock, redistributed the energy, found its new uneasy equilibrium, and then he sat at the kitchen table with a blank piece of parchment. He wrote the letter as a Gringotts curse breaker. That was the deliberate choice. Not as Arthur's son, not as someone who had grown up thinking of Albus Dumbledore as the unassailable moral authority of the wizarding world. As a professional, with a professional finding that required a professional response. He noted the date of the examination. He noted Harry's age. He described the 17 workings by category in the clinical, numbered language of Gringotts field reports, without editorializing. He noted the one he'd attributed to Dumbledore's work. He noted the ones he could not yet classify. He did not accuse. He requested a meeting at the headmaster's convenience, earliest possible. He sent it with one of the Burrow's owls, an elderly bird named Errol, who seemed deeply affronted by being woken at this hour. The reply came that afternoon, which was fast enough to tell Bill that Dumbledore had been expecting something like this, or had at least found it unsurprising. The letter was a single paragraph. It was warm in tone and unhurried in its phrasing, and it contained no denial of any specific claim. It acknowledged the meeting. It expressed what it called a genuine interest in discussing these findings properly. And at the end of it, I look forward to the opportunity for clarity, which I confess has been long overdue. Bill read it 3 times. The phrase was not an apology. It was not a confession. It was an acknowledgement, wrapped in the courtesy of a man who had spent 113 years becoming very good at saying precisely what he meant, and nothing more. Opportunity for clarity. As though the 17 workings on an unwitting 14-year-old were a misunderstanding about a schedule. Arthur came and read it over his shoulder. Neither of them said anything. He found Harry in the garden the next morning. It was becoming their place, the low stone wall and the overgrown grass and the early light, and asked him about the scar. Harry described it the way he described most things that frightened him. Briefly, accurately, with the tone of someone giving directions to a place they've had to visit too often. The scar hurt. It had been hurting. It hurt more when he was near large concentrations of dark magic, or when something particularly violent was happening, or sometimes for no obvious reason at all. "Last night," Bill said, "when the scar hurt, did it feel like it was coming from the outside, like a signal reaching you? Or from the inside, like something being pulled?" Harry was quiet for a moment. He looked at Bill as though no one had ever asked him to make that distinction, which was probably true. "Inside," he said. "Definitely inside. Like—" he stopped. "Like a rope someone grabbed and yanked." Bill wrote in his classification journal that night, "Tether responsive to external magical violence, active rather than static." And then he underlined the word tether, and then he closed the notebook, because there was nothing useful he could do with the information at the moment, and he'd learned, over years of field work, that the impulse to act immediately on alarming data was how fieldwork got people killed. The Hogwarts letters arrived 2 days later. Harry's and Ron's both at once, the usual seal on the usual parchment, and in them the usual book lists and the usual instructions, and this year an unusual note. In addition to school robes, students were requested to bring dress robes suitable for a formal occasion, details to follow. Harry sat with the letter in his hands for a while after Ron had gone inside, still reading it or appearing to. The morning was cooling now, autumn finding its way into August. Bill watched him and did not speak. He was thinking. Bill knew because Harry was always thinking, even when he was still. And the shape of what he was thinking was visible in the way he held the letter, the way his eyes had gone slightly inward. He was going back to Hogwarts for the first time knowing what he carried. That was not the same as going back, having had it removed. That was not better, exactly. But it was different, and different at the moment was what they had. Harry folded the letter and put it in his pocket. He stood up. "Come on then," he said, and went inside. The night before he returned to Hogwarts, Harry sat on the floor of Ron's room with a blank sheet of parchment and tried to figure out how to begin. He had written to Sirius before about things that were trying to kill him. That was in some sense easier. A threat had a shape. It arrived from outside, from a person or a creature or a set of circumstances that could be named and described and warned about. This was different. What Bill had found was not a threat from outside. It was a disclosure about what had always been inside, 17 workings layered into his skin and his magic and his soul before he was old enough to have an opinion about any of it. He started with the number, 17. He let it sit at the top of the page. Then he described each category the way Bill had described it to him, the protective ones, the ministry trace, the bond of blood. He wrote Dumbledore's name without pausing, because the pause would make it too large to get past. The killing curse, residue in the scar. The soul fragment, not his own soul, someone else's, attached to him the way a piece of barnacle attaches to hull, and the parseltongue that had come with it. The dark tether that Bill had drawn a box around and labelled most alarming, and the 9 suppression bindings of unknown origin that had been capping his magical output since early childhood, sitting in him all those years in the cupboard under the stairs and across the dinner table from the Dursleys and in classrooms at Hogwarts where people kept calling him remarkable. He did not know if Sirius would understand all of it. He sent the letter. The reply arrived on the 2nd day of term, tucked into his bedside chair while he was at breakfast. It was brief, 2 paragraphs, and Sirius's writing was cramped in the specific way it always was when he was trying not to write what he actually wanted to say. He said, "This is not something to discuss safely in a letter." He said, "I need to see your face when we talk about this." He described the method: a flue connection from his hidden location, a common room fireplace late on a Tuesday night when the dormitory above would be empty. Harry read it twice and folded it into the inside pocket of his robes. On Tuesday, he told Ron he needed an hour alone, which Ron absorbed with the uncomplicated acceptance of someone who had sat with Harry in a garden for half an afternoon without asking questions. Ron went up to bed. Harry sat in front of the common room fire until the coals had died to their lowest, and then he put a small handful of powder into the grate and spoke the words. Sirius's face in the flames was the same face it always was, thin, grey-eyed, angular, built for a sharper version of Azkaban than most people could imagine. And for a moment, it was just that. The face of the one person Harry had outside of Hogwarts who had known his father. Then Sirius looked at him properly, and whatever expression he was holding moved behind his eyes and settled into something else. "The suppression bindings," Sirius said. "Not hello. Not are you all right. Describe them exactly as Bill did." Harry described them. Bill's phrase was designed to cap magical output. He said it the way Bill had said it, without inflection. Sirius went quiet. Not the quiet of a man who has nothing to say, but the quiet of a man choosing very carefully which part of what he's thinking to say first. "He was right to flag them as deliberate," Sirius said finally. "They're not accidental, and they're not ministry. I recognize the pattern." Harry felt something in his chest go still. "From where?" "The House of Black," Sirius said. There was something in his voice that Harry had not heard there before. Not quite bitterness, not quite grief, but the specific quality of someone who grew up in a house where you learned things you spent your whole subsequent life wishing you hadn't. My family's library had theoretical texts on binding magic that most wizarding families have never seen. Things that go back centuries. The architecture of what Bill described, layered restriction on magical output, installed in early childhood, growing with the subject. I've seen the theory of it. I've seen what it's supposed to achieve. "Who placed them?" Harry said. Sirius looked at him. "I can't prove it from here." "But you think you know." "I think," Sirius said carefully, "that the magic Bill described is not the kind of thing a ministry administrator can produce, and it's not the kind of thing an enemy places to cap a child's power and then leaves intact for 13 years while that child attends Hogwarts. If an enemy wanted to suppress your magic, they would want to be watching it. Whatever place those bindings wanted them to persist without anyone noticing." Harry said. "Dumbledore." Sirius said. "I cannot prove it from here." "He knew about the bond of blood," he said. "Not the full technical detail, but the shape of it. He had always understood, in the years since Azkaban, why Dumbledore had insisted Harry go back to the Dursleys every summer. He'd understood the logic of blood ward protections, that Petunia accepting Harry into her home had sealed something, and that something was the strongest shield Dumbledore knew how to build. He had disagreed with it. He had spent 3 years as a freed man disagreeing with it, in the abstract and specific terms of someone who had watched Harry come back from Privet Drive every autumn, with the careful, self-contained stillness of a person who has learned to take up very little space. But he had not known about the 9. The anger, when Harry looked at his face, was visible in the set of his jaw and the particular way his eyes had gone very level, very controlled. The look, Harry imagined, of a man sitting in a flue fireplace reminding himself that the 14-year-old on the other end did not need to watch him be furious. Whatever Dumbledore's reasons were, Sirius said, he should have told you. Harry looked at the fire around Sirius's face. He thought about what he was going to ask next. He had been thinking about asking it since the garden at the Burrow, since the morning after Bill told him the number, since he had sat in the quiet of the Weasley kitchen and tried to calculate what his life had actually been. "Did he know," Harry said, "when he left me with the Dursleys? Did he know what it would be like? Did he choose my life with them, knowing what it cost me?" The fire crackled. Sirius looked at him for a long moment, and what moved behind his grey eyes was something complex enough that Harry could not name it. "I think," Sirius said at last, "that he chose what he believed would keep you alive." That was not an answer to what Harry had asked. He could hear that Sirius knew it. The silence between them carried that knowledge like ballast. "I'll see Dumbledore in the morning," Harry said. "Bill's arranged the meeting." "I know," Sirius said. "Write to me after." The flames died. The common room was very dark, very quiet, with only the last of the normal fire burning low in the grate. Harry sat in front of it for a while without moving. The window above the portrait hole showed a rectangle of Scottish night sky. No moon tonight, just the darkness and the cold stars that had been there long before any of this, and would be there long after. He thought about the number. 17. He thought about Sirius's face, saying, "I think he chose what he believed would keep you alive," which was what a man said when he wanted to be fair to someone he was furious with, when he was still trying to give the benefit of a doubt he was no longer entirely sure was owed. He thought about how that particular sentence did not answer the question he had asked, which was not about what Dumbledore had believed, but about what Dumbledore had known. He stood up. He went to bed. In the morning he would sit in Dumbledore's office and ask that question again, in the room where it had to be answered, across the desk of the man who could actually answer it. That was something. That was what he had. He put out the lamp beside his bed and lay in the dark with his 17 workings and the tether that had been quiet all evening, pulling gently at nothing, patient as something that has been waiting a very long time and has learned not to rush. The stone gargoyle stepped aside without being asked, which meant Dumbledore had left it standing open. Bill noticed this. Harry saw him notice the small intake of breath, the recalibration, the understanding that a man who leaves his office door open for a meeting like this one has been expecting it for longer than any letter implied. McGonagall met them at the entrance on a Saturday morning, when the grounds were quiet and the other students had no reason to watch two people cross the courtyard. She was in her green teaching robes, her dark hair up, and she had read the shape of the situation in the time it took Bill to shake her hand. "The headmaster is expecting you," she said, and led them as far as the moving staircase before turning back without another word. The office was circular, cluttered with purpose. Silver instruments turned on their spindles. The portraits of former headmasters maintained insufficient pretenses of sleep. Fawkes watched from his perch with the patient gravity of something that has seen too many things to be surprised. Dumbledore was behind his desk. He looked at Harry first, not at Bill, not at the doorway. His expression was not quite sorrow and not quite relief. The expression of a man who has known for a long time that a particular morning was coming and has not allowed himself to feel ready for it. He did not look surprised. "Please sit," he said. Bill placed his notebook on the edge of the desk, not an aggressive gesture, but a deliberate one. "This is a professional consultation," the notebook said, "not a family matter." He began without preamble, going through each category in order. The protective enchantments, Lily Potter's sacrificial magic, ancient and involuntary. He described the signature of it. Then the trace, ministry standard and expected. Then the bond of blood. He named Dumbledore. He said it the way a surveyor names a wall. This structure, here, placed by this party, origin confirmed by the construction method, and the magical signature distinctive to the most powerful wizard currently practicing in Britain. He described the bond of blood's function without inflection. The sacrificial protection channeled through a living blood relative, sealed into the household, the strongest ward of its type the age had produced. Dumbledore had not moved. He had not interrupted. When Bill finished, Dumbledore said, "Yes, that is accurate." He explained it, not because it could be denied, but because denying it would have been dishonest, and Dumbledore was many things but not dishonest, or not in the way that looked like lying. Petunia Dursley was the only blood relative remaining. The sacrificial protection required a blood anchor. The ward required her acceptance of Harry into her home. "Your mother's sacrifice made the bond of blood the strongest shield I could give you," he said. Bill said, "That's one. The trace is the ministry's. That leaves 15. Dumbledore said, "Yes." Bill continued. "The killing curse residue, the scar's magical component, expected, enemy origin, confirmed by both signature and history." Dumbledore nodded. Then the soul fragment, a non-Harry origin piece of identity attached to Harry's person, partially integrated into his magical expression with characteristics Bill had seen in Egyptian object soul bindings, but never in a living subject. Then the 9. Bill described them in the same language he had used in the Burrow's kitchen, deliberately placed, childhood origin, no ministry source, no enemy characteristics. Their function was restriction. At 14, with the magical inheritance Harry's parentage would predict, his native capacity should register far above what the scan showed. Something had been capping it since before he could form clear memories. The room was quiet. Fawkes shifted on his perch. One of the portraits had stopped pretending to sleep. Dumbledore was silent for a long time, not a silence without answer, but a silence choosing how much of the answer was the right amount. He said, "I will need time to explain that properly." Bill said, "You have now." Dumbledore said, "The context requires a foundation I cannot build in a single morning. The decisions were made in grief, in the months after October 1981, when the full picture was not yet clear. I am not dismissing your concern. I am telling you that the explanation is not a short one." Bill wrote something in his notebook. Harry said, "Did you know about all of them?" It was the first thing he had said since sitting down. His voice came out even. Dumbledore looked at him. He held his gaze without softening, without reaching for the gentle distance he usually kept in this room, and Harry understood that the answer coming was being given the weight it was owed. "Not all," Dumbledore said. "Not in the beginning." The office held that sentence. Harry heard what was inside it. Not a denial, not a justification, just the precise shape of an admission. There had been a beginning. There had been a time after the beginning when more was known, and there had been a still further time when all of it was known, and through all of that time, Harry had not been told. He did not press further. He let Dumbledore live with having said it. Bill described the dark tether last. His language changed at the edges here, more careful than it had been with the others, because this was the working he understood least, and was most alarmed by simultaneously. He placed it at the deepest layer, beneath everything else. He described its character, cold, purposeful, analogous to a funerary object soul binding, but applied to a living subject. Something at the other end, not Harry's, present, connected, possessed of an intention that read as organized. He asked what it was. Dumbledore's face changed. Not dramatically. He was a man who had spent 113 years learning to govern his expression, and most people would have seen nothing. But Harry had been in this office before, and had sat across this desk in circumstances that were various shades of terrible, and he knew what stillness looked like on Dumbledore's face, and what it looked like when something moved underneath it. Something moved. Dumbledore said, "I am aware of that particular matter. It is extremely complex. I have been monitoring it." Bill said, "For how long?" Dumbledore said, "Longer than I would have wished." The silence that followed was the confirmation. It arrived in the room, and no one spoke over it. And somewhere in the portraits above the desk, a former headmaster was carefully looking elsewhere. Longer than I would have wished. A sentence that meant before Harry had been old enough to be told. Before a great many decisions that might have been made differently. Harry stood up. He did not say anything else. He picked up his bag from beside the chair and looked at Dumbledore once. Not with anger, because anger would have required him to believe Dumbledore had not thought about any of this, and the expression on the old man's face made that impossible. And then he walked to the office door and went through it. He waited on the landing for Bill. The door opened after a moment, and Bill came out, and they walked down the moving staircase together without speaking. At the bottom, the gargoyle stepped back into place. Outside, the grounds were quiet. The lake was a flat sheet of grey under the October sky, and somewhere above the castle, a crow was calling at nothing. Bill said, "That was the beginning." Harry looked at the water for a moment. "I know," he said. The goblet of fire spat out Harry's name on a Thursday evening in late October, and the great hall went very still, and Harry sat and did not move for a moment that was probably shorter than it felt. He had known it might happen. That was the part that was different from canon, from what his life would have been without Bill's scan. He had known since the night of the weighing of the wands, since the night before term started, since every quiet moment between then and now, when he had counted 17 and thought about what a Tri-Wizard tournament was designed to do to a 17-year-old wizard, let alone a 14-year-old with most of his magic held back by bindings he hadn't consented to and couldn't remove. He got up. He went through the door at the end of the hall. He wrote to Bill that night with the quill going fast and slightly crooked, the way it went when he was keeping himself very deliberate about being calm. Bill's reply arrived the next morning. It was 3 sentences. The first, "The tournament contract is magically binding. There is no mechanism for withdrawal once the goblet selects a champion." Harry already knew this from Dumbledore, who had said it in a room full of teachers with an expression that managed to be both apologetic and resolute at once. The second, "The suppression bindings have been loosening under stress since August. What's happening to his magic is happening regardless of whether he competes." The third, "At least this way, we can observe it." Harry folded the letter and put it in his school bag and went to potions, where he sat at the back and thought about the word observe, which was Bill's professional word for something that had no good alternatives. The weeks between October and the task in November had a particular quality. Pressurized, the school divided in the way schools divide when they want someone to be guilty of something. Ron, for reasons Harry didn't examine too carefully, was not entirely speaking to him. Hermione was, and she had taken up residence in the library with the focused ferocity of someone who has been given a research problem and refuses to be bested by it. Bill's second letter, the week before the task, described what he had worked out from studying his August scan data. The 9 suppression bindings were not static. They flexed. Under sufficient magical duress, They loosened temporarily, like a cast that shifts under sudden weight, releasing access to magical capacity Harry didn't normally have, but in an uneven and unpredictable way. The analogy he used was pressure from a crack rather than from a valve. Less power, less control. The crack didn't stay open. His warning: don't overreach. Your instincts will want more than you can sustain. The loosening won't hold once the duress passes. Harry read this on the evening before the task, in an empty classroom, sitting on a desk. He read it twice. He thought about the word instincts, and about what his instincts had been saying consistently since August, which was, the magic is there, underneath, waiting. You can feel it. You just can't reach it. He went to bed and did not sleep especially well. The morning of the first task, they took the champions to an enclosure adjacent to the arena where the crowd was already making the ground vibrate underfoot. Harry had been told what was in there. Hermione had found it out. And knowing in advance produced its own cold, settled feeling, the way knowing the shape of something bad in advance at least gives you something specific to brace against. A Hungarian horntail, the biggest and most aggressive of the 4 dragons. His. Of course, his. He had worked out his strategy with Hermione. The Accio for his firebolt would be cleaner and faster than it had any right to be, because his magical instinct was sharpened, and the binding across his summoning had been the first to loosen in the Burrow garden. He had practiced the incantation all week. He knew he could do it. He just didn't know what would happen after. In the enclosure, waiting, he thought about Bill watching from the stands. He thought about Observe. The task began. The horntail was enormous and black, and moved with the fast, angular menace of something that has decided you are a problem to be solved. Harry ran. He pulled his wand. He said Accio firebolt and felt the magic come. Felt it differently than he had felt it before. Not the thin, surface-level response he'd been getting since August. Not the flat, gauze-covered absence he'd noticed at the Burrows' dinner table when the salt wouldn't move. This was deeper. The binding had loosened exactly as Bill said it would under duress, and the firebolt came from the castle at a speed that surprised even him. He caught it. He mounted. He got airborne. And then he tried for a second spell. A distraction. Something to draw the horntail's attention from the egg to him. And the output stuttered. The gap Bill had described. The crack. It didn't stay open. The binding had flexed but not vanished, and what he reached for next wasn't there in the same way. The spell came out half-formed and sideways, not what he'd intended, and the horntail reacted to the unpredictability with more violence than it would have reacted to something clean and directed. It moved faster than it should have. It was harder, not easier, to predict. Harry improvised. He was good at improvising, had been practicing it in one form or another his entire life, and he was running at a raw magical instinct the suppression bindings had never let him feel before. He trusted the first spell and his broom, and the fact that a firebolt was, in its class, the fastest thing in the sky. He got the egg. His route to it was not elegant. He came down with the golden egg under one arm and a burn across his left shoulder from a near miss he didn't register until he was on the ground, and the crowd noise had resolved into something he could organize into meaning. He sat on a rock in the enclosure and breathed. That was when the scar flared, not the sharp, directional pain of proximity. Voldemort wasn't here, wasn't anywhere near here in any embodied sense, was still the wraith and shade that Pettigrew was serving somewhere in a distant part of England. This was different. This was the tether. The deep, cold working that Bill had drawn a box around and labelled most alarming. It had come alive in response to the task, to the extreme magical duress, to the moment when the suppression bindings had cracked open and allowed something more like Harry's true magic to move. The tether had felt it. It was brief, a tremor rather than a seizure, a recognition rather than an intrusion. Something at the other end becoming aware of the loosening. Not looking yet. Not fully, but turning slightly, the way something turns when it hears a sound. Harry held the egg tighter. The feeling passed. In the stands, he learned later, Bill had seen the flinch register in Harry's body language from 40 rows up, and had made a note in his classification journal. Tether active under task conditions, not triggered by proximity, triggered by Harry's own magical duress. Hermione was waiting at the enclosure's exit. She had a jar of something bluish for the burn on his shoulder, and a look on her face that was mostly relief, and secondarily something else, focused, measuring, the look she wore when she was turning a problem over and had landed on the side she didn't like. "I've been in the library," she said. "Since August, really. Since you told me about the soul fragment and the borrowed parcel tongue." She opened the jar and handed it to him. "I've looked under every related term I can find. Soul binding, dark tethering, foreign soul fragment, ancient Egyptian K-theory, Bill's phrase, from his letter." "And?" Harry said. "Nothing," she said. "There's a gap in the restricted section. Several volumes. The librarian says they were removed by headmaster's request. She doesn't know when." She was quiet for a moment. "The absence of a word in a library this size, Harry, that's not an accident. Someone decided we shouldn't be able to find it." She said it without accusation, but what she meant was clear. Harry nodded. He already knew. His scores came in respectable and uneven, which was the appropriate description for what had happened. He went back to the castle. He ate. He thought about the absence of a word in a library, and what a headmaster would have to know and choose to remove it. Bill's letter arrived that night. He wrote that the task had accelerated something he could not fully quantify, that the tether was more defined now than it had been in August, pulling toward a shape it hadn't had before. Voldemort was not yet restored, but something was building in that direction. Bill needed more time. He was not sure they had it. Harry read the letter in bed with the golden egg beside him on the pillow, its shell cool and smooth and still refusing to give up whatever it was screaming about. He put the letter on his bedside table. He put out the lamp. The tether was quiet. For now. Hermione had been keeping a list. It had started the night Harry told her about the 17 bindings. The categories, Bill's language, the dark tether, Bill had drawn a box around and flagged as the most alarming of the lot. She had written down every term Bill had used, and then written down every related term she could derive from them, and she had taken that list into the Hogwarts library and worked through it systematically, the way she worked through everything that mattered, thoroughly, without letting the absence of results count as a reason to stop. Soul binding, dark tethering, foreign soul fragment, parasitic enchantment, involuntary possession, ancient Egyptian K-theory, this last from Bill's first letter, which Harry had shown her in the week after the World Cup. The library had nothing useful on any of them. Not nothing. There were passing references, footnotes, the kind of peripheral mention that confirmed a thing existed without explaining what it was. But nothing that would let her name what was in Harry with any precision. The restricted section was more promising, or would have been. The gap in its shelves was impossible to miss once you were looking for it. 3 or 4 volumes at minimum, based on the spacing. She had found the catalogue entry for one of them, a text on Egyptian funerary magic and its applications to living subjects, which was exactly the category of thing she needed. She asked the Hogwarts librarian about it. The librarian checked her records and said the volumes in that section had been removed at the headmaster's request. She said it without any apparent sense of the weight it carried, the way people say things that have stopped seeming unusual only because they have been unusual for a very long time. Hermione wrote in her notes, "Volumes removed, headmaster's request, date unclear." She underlined it twice. She was not sure if she was angry yet, or if she was just methodical, which for Hermione was sometimes the same thing. The letter from Bill arrived for Harry in November, forwarded from the Burrow. It had been sent there first because Bill had written it before he knew Harry was back at school, which told Hermione something about how long the letter had been in transit, and how long Bill had been sitting on what it contained. Harry brought it to her in the common room after dinner. He hadn't read it alone first, which meant he already knew it was something he would need to read with other people present. She sat across from him on the hearthrug. Ron was at the chessboard behind them, ostensibly playing against himself. The letter was longer than Bill's letters usually were. He wrote that he had spent several weeks working through Gringotts Egypt's internal research archive. Professional access, not available to the public, not catalogued in any wizarding library she would have reached. He had been looking for precedents, object soul bindings of the specific type his scan had identified in Harry, something to explain what a tether of that kind meant, functionally, for the person carrying it. He had found it in the records of ancient Egyptian protective funerary magic. He called it a car tether. In the original funerary context, it worked like this. A fragment of the deceased's life force, their car in the Egyptian system, the animating part of the soul, was sealed into an object at the moment of death. The vessel had to survive. As long as the vessel survived, the deceased existed in some form. The vessel's destruction was the condition for genuine passage. Death, in the full sense, required the vessel to be broken. The pattern Bill had identified in Harry matched this in every structural particular, with one difference. The soul on the other end of the tether was not a deceased person. It was a living one, or what had once been living. Something diminished, fragmented, existing in a form that was not exactly life, and not exactly death, but occupied some condition between the two. Bill wrote, "I cannot say what this means for you without knowing who or what is on the other end of the tether. But the implication of the Egyptian precedent is clear. The tether holder's existence may depend on the vessel not being destroyed." He had underlined the next sentence. "The vessel may be you." Harry read the letter twice. Then he handed it to Hermione without speaking. She read it. She heard Ron's chess pieces moving behind her, the small sounds of a game proceeding. She thought about the restricted section. She thought about volumes removed at a headmaster's request. "So if whoever is on the other end of this dies," Harry said when she handed the letter back, "I might be damaged." "Or," Hermione said carefully, because precision mattered here and the other direction of the implication was equally important to name, "if you die, they might be protected by the vessel surviving or failing to." Neither of them had a word for the thing in Harry. The word was somewhere in the absent section of the restricted section. Someone had decided it should not be available to a student trying to find it. Behind them, Ron knocked over his own king. "Bill's going to fix it," he said. It was not a question. It was Ron being 14 and deeply unwilling to sit with the alternative, which Hermione understood, because she was 15 and deeply unwilling to sit with it herself. But the sentence landed in the space between them, with the weight of something it was not quite able to carry, and neither she nor Harry said anything in response. And after a moment, Ron set his king back upright and went back to the game. The defense teacher had been watching Harry more closely since the first task. Harry noticed it the way he noticed most things about adults who looked at him with that particular quality of attention without making a show of noticing, cataloguing it, and keeping it. The defense teacher's magical eye, which moved independently of the other and saw through things it had no business seeing through, had a way of tracking Harry across a classroom with the focus of professional assessment rather than teaching. It had felt this way before, Harry thought. It felt different now. He had told Bill about the defense teacher in a letter after the task. He had described the way the magical eye seemed to pause on him at moments when Harry's magic had done something unexpected, when the partial loosening had produced output he shouldn't have been capable of at 14, when the gap in the bindings had cracked open briefly before closing again. Bill had written back, "Keep your distance where possible. I'm working on something. Don't give him specific information about the bindings." Harry kept his distance. He did not give specific information. He watched back, the way he had learned from the Dursleys to watch the people in a room who held power over outcomes. The egg's secret came to him in the prefect's bathroom in the middle of November, which was not a location Harry had ever expected to produce useful revelations. But Hermione had done the research, and this was where the research pointed. He sat on the edge of the bath with the egg open and the hot water running and waited. Underwater, the egg sang. The clue was about the lake and the mer-people, and something that would be taken from him and kept for an hour. He heard it faster than he might have in August. The partial loosening had not just opened gaps in his spell work. It had sharpened something more general, a way of feeling the magic in things, of letting information that was encoded in a non-verbal form land and organize without having to translate it fully into language first. The song made sense. He closed the egg. He thought about the lake at Hogwarts in February. He wrote to Bill that night. The reply was brief, only a few lines at the bottom of a longer letter about what Bill had found in the archive. But those lines contained a decision. He was not going back to Egypt. He had arranged a transfer to Gringotts, London. The reason on record, he wrote, was ongoing professional consultation on a complex case. The reason not on record, Harry had 17 bindings and a tether that was growing more defined every time Bill checked his data, and Bill was not in the habit of leaving a field site in the middle of an active excavation, because the work was inconvenient. He had, he wrote, never found a more important artifact in 3 years of Egypt. He did not mean it warmly. He meant it as a statement of professional fact. That it landed as warmth was something Harry sat with for a while before he went to sleep, listening to the winter rain against the dormitory window, and the sound of Neville breathing in the bed beside him, and the distant, low awareness of the tether, patient and cold, and still pulling toward whatever it had always been pulling toward. In the morning before the second task, Harry's scar was quiet. The tether was not. It had been this way for weeks, a low, cold awareness that had no particular quality he could name, not pain and not a vision, just the sense of something at the other end of it that had moved from dormant to directed. Pettigrew was somewhere. Something was being prepared, piece by piece, with the patience of someone who has waited a long time and is accustomed to it. Harry couldn't see any of this with clarity. He could only feel the tether's new purposefulness, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Not the storm itself, but the promise of it. He had prepared differently than he would have in August. Knowing about the bindings had changed the texture of preparation. Not what he was going to do, because the gillyweed solution was the only viable one, and he and Hermione had landed on it weeks ago, but how he held himself going into it. He was not trying to predict what his magic would do at any specific moment. He was trying to stay adaptive, to catch the surges when they came, and work around the gaps when they didn't. Because the bindings didn't loosen on a schedule, and the lake would not wait for him to get his footing. He stood at the edge of the lake, in the February grey, and swallowed the gillyweed, and went in. The cold hit immediately, a shock of it, the Black Lake in February being the kind of cold that takes the mind blank for a moment before the body adjusts. The gillyweed worked, the gills opened at his neck and his hands and feet shifted, and the water organized itself from obstacle to medium, from something to fight through to something to move in. He stopped. He had expected to be navigating by sight, by the grey underwater light filtering down from the surface. What he had not expected was the sensation that replaced it, or rather, supplemented it. The partial loosening from the first task had not reset entirely. It had settled lower than it was at peak duress, but it had not returned to August baseline, and what it had left him with in the intervening months was something he had begun to think of as a different kind of sight. A sensitivity to other magic, ambient and environmental, the way you might feel the heat of a fire from across a room even when you're looking the other way. Underwater, with the surface noise gone and the suppressants partially lifted, it was extraordinarily clear. He could feel the mer-people settlement before he could see it, a warm, diffuse cluster of organized magic, inhabited and purposeful, to the northeast. He could feel the binding charms on the hostages like 4 separate points of heat in the dark water, distinct in temperature and character. He oriented to the closest one. Ron, he knew, was his assigned hostage. He moved toward the cluster. The task, for the first 20 minutes, was not difficult. His instincts underwater were better than they had been in every previous encounter with the lake, better calibrated, faster to respond. When a Grindylow came at him from the left, he felt it before it arrived, and put a repelling jinx between them without breaking his momentum. The spell came clean. The binding across that particular output had been among the earliest to loosen. He found the hostages at the mer-people settlement. They were tethered to a stone column at the lake's floor. Ron, Hermione, a girl Harry recognized as Cho Chang, and Fleur Delacour's younger sister, Gabrielle, small, with silver-blonde hair drifting upward in the current. Sleeping. All of them sleeping. The binding charms on them were visible to his changed perception as a faint warmth around their wrists. He worked at Ron's binding first, which was the work of 30 seconds. His underwater magic was responsive. He freed Ron and checked the time. He was here too early. The other champions hadn't arrived yet, and he had perhaps 20 minutes remaining on the gillyweed. He looked at the other 3 hostages. He knew what the task wanted him to do: take his hostage and go. He had been told by the mer-people's song in the egg that the hostages were safe, that they would not be harmed. He understood this. He also understood that somewhere above him, Fleur Delacour had not yet reached the lake's floor. He could feel the absence of her magical signature from the entry point, which meant she had not made it this far down. And Gabrielle was here, asleep, and Fleur was not going to reach her. The impulse was not a decision, exactly. It was more like the salt at the dinner table in August, the instinctive reaching for a thing that should be within reach. Except this time, the bindings had loosened enough that when he reached, something answered. He freed Gabrielle. He pulled Ron with one hand and Gabrielle with the other and pointed himself at the surface. The cost registered immediately. He was deeper than he should be, and his time was shorter than he'd calculated, and the lake was dark above him for a long way. He kicked. He swam hard. It was somewhere in the last ascent, in the cold black water 20 feet below the surface, that the tether flared. Not the ambient low-level awareness he'd been living with for months. This was directional, a pull that had orientation, that came from somewhere specific, far to the north and east, past the boundary of Hogwarts grounds, past the mountains, in a direction that felt like preparation rather than presence. Something was being assembled. Not yet a person. Not yet here. But moving toward it, piece by patient piece, and the tether knew it and lit up like a wire completing a circuit. Harry lost his rhythm for 3 strokes. He caught it back. He broke the surface 40 minutes and 7 seconds after the task had begun. He was late. His head came up gasping, and the February air hit his face like something solid, and he held on to Ron with one arm and to Gabrielle with the other, and didn't let go of either of them until the judge's boat was there and someone was helping them in. The tether went quiet again. The effort of the ascent had grounded it, or whatever it was receded when he was fully above the water and in the noise and motion of the world. He sat in the boat and breathed. Bill was waiting at the edge of the arena, which was not a surprise. He had arranged to be here. The London desk job was flexible in the ways that mattered, and he had his notebook out before Harry had finished wrapping a towel around his shoulders. The secondary scan took 4 minutes. Bill's face, during those 4 minutes, had the closed-off professional quality that Harry had learned to read as the face he wore when the data was significant, and he was deciding how to present it. 6 of the suppression bindings are gone, Bill said. Not loosened, gone. They didn't reset. 3 more are critically weakened. They'll collapse under less than Task 1 conditions. He paused. 6 are holding. How does that compare to August? Harry asked. In August you had 9. Now you have 6. You're running at roughly twice the magical output you were then. He looked at Harry directly. You're still capped at less than half of what you should naturally be at 14. The ones that are holding are the oldest and deepest workings on the list. Harry looked at the water. The surface had gone still again, reflecting a flat February sky. Those are the ones Dumbledore placed, he said. Bill said nothing. That was answer enough. He found Hermione later that evening in the common room, after the official results had been announced, and the points had been awarded, and Ron had woken up and been briefly incredulous at the cold, and then immediately hungry. She was sitting in the chair nearest the fire, with Bill's archive notes spread across her knees, and an interlibrary request slip from a wizarding archive Harry had never heard of sitting on the cushion beside her. She had found something. He could tell from the quality of her stillness. Not the stillness of someone who hasn't found anything, but the stillness of someone who has found something they wish they hadn't. I'm going to tell Bill first, she said when she saw him looking. Tomorrow, when I can write to him properly. All right, Harry said. She didn't look at him. She looked at the fire with the expression of someone reviewing something she has read several times and is still hoping will mean something different on the next pass. He did not press her. He went to bed. The tether was quiet. The lake was quiet. Somewhere far to the north and east, whatever had lit up the circuit during the ascent had gone back to its patient assembly, and the night at Hogwarts was just the night at Hogwarts, cold and ordinary, and nothing yet. April arrived, and Harry stopped sleeping through the night. It was not the same as having bad dreams. He knew bad dreams. He had been having them since he was old enough to remember the flash of green light and a woman's voice and the sense of something enormous ending. This was different. These were not scenes. They were sensations. A cold purposefulness bleeding through the tether into his sleep. Something at the other end of it that was not a person yet, but was becoming one, assembling intention the way a storm assembles before you can see it, naming him by feel rather than by sight. He would wake to find himself already standing beside his bed in the dark dormitory, his wand in his hand, his body having made a decision his conscious mind hadn't caught up to. Ron pretended not to notice. He did it with some skill, the deliberate incuriosity of someone who has decided the most useful thing he can offer is the absence of questions. He was 15 now, had been since March, and he never once looked at Harry the way someone looks at a person they are worried about. Bill came to Hogwarts in the second week of April and ran the third scan in a small room off the entrance hall. When he finished, he sat with his notebook for a moment before speaking. "The 6 destabilized bindings are gone," he said, "not weakened, absent. The pattern from the second task held. Once they crack beyond a threshold, they don't come back. 3 more are critically weakened. I don't think they'll survive the maze." He paused. 6 remain. The oldest ones. They're still holding. "How much capacity am I running at now?" Harry said. "Approximately 3 times August. Still less than half of what should be your natural level at 14. Bill closed the notebook. "The tether is different." He turned it over in his hands, as though weighing the phrasing. "It has a directional quality it didn't have before. It's pointing. Not toward a location, exactly, but toward something converging, like the difference between a compass pointing north and a compass pointing at something specific that's moving north." Harry thought about April mornings and standing beside his bed with his wand already out. "I know," he said. "I can feel it." Bill said nothing for a moment. Then, "When are you going to see Dumbledore about it?" Harry said, "Today." He went alone. Bill had arranged the first meeting, and its formality had produced a certain kind of confrontation that had stopped exactly where it stopped. Harry needed a different one. He knocked on the office door and went in without waiting for more than the opening. Dumbledore looked up from his desk. He had the expression Harry had been seeing on his face all year. Something new to it, a quality of grief that had not been there in the years before, that had appeared the day Bill laid 17 bindings on his desk and said, "Here is what you have done and not done." Dumbledore looked at Harry and did not look surprised that he had come, and said nothing, waiting. Harry sat down. He said, "What is inside me?" The office was quiet. The instruments turned. Outside the window, the April sky was the pale, clear blue of a Scottish spring. Dumbledore said, "Something that should not be in a living person. A piece of a damaged soul attached to you without intention on anyone's part. It was not placed deliberately. It was the consequence of an act of terrible violence meeting a protection of equally terrible love, and the result was something no one planned for." "Voldemort's," Harry said. "Yes." It was the first time anyone had said it plainly to him. Bill had said, "dark tether." Hermione had said, "K-tether." He had said it himself in the dormitory at night, turning it over, but hearing it confirmed by the one person who had always known and had always chosen silence made it land differently. Harry said, "And if Voldemort dies, with that piece of himself still in me?" Dumbledore looked at him with something that was very close to the face of a man who has been waiting for this question and doesn't have an answer he is willing to give to a 14-year-old boy sitting across from him in April. He said, "That is what I have been trying to determine how to manage safely for many years." Harry looked at him. He thought about Bill's letter from the Burrow. "Give me tonight." He thought about the morning after, in the garden. He thought about a man who had been monitoring something extremely complex and had not mentioned it, and about the phrase "longer than I would have wished," and about volumes removed from a library at a headmaster's request. He said, "I would have liked to be consulted." He stood up and walked to the door and went through it without waiting for a response. On the landing, the stone gargoyle stepped back. He went down the moving staircase and kept walking until the castle swallowed him, then stood for a moment with his hand against the wall and breathed. He went to find Hermione. She was in the common room, where she had been since the day after the second task whenever she wasn't in class. She looked up when he came in, and Ron looked up from the chessboard, and the quality of their attention told him they had both been waiting. Hermione said, "I should tell you what I found." She had been telling Bill first, every step of the way, since the February letter. She had been working from Bill's archive notes and an interlibrary request to a wizarding archive that had answered where the Hogwarts library couldn't. The text she had found used the phrase "severing the anchor" in the context of the cathedra. She told Harry what it said. The severing could be done, but the method it described required the destruction of the vessel's structural integrity. Harry sat down. He translated it the way you translate something you have already worked out and are hoping you have wrong. "It means I have to die," he said. "It might mean that," Hermione said. Her voice was steady in the specific way that it went steady when she was holding something difficult with both hands and refusing to drop it. "Or Voldemort could die first," Harry said, "with the piece of himself that's in me. If he died while I was still alive, the anchor breaking from the tetherholder's side, not the vessel's." "And what would that do to you?" Hermione said. Harry said, "I don't know. Bill doesn't know. Dumbledore hasn't told us." The three of them sat with it. The fire cracked. Ron had gone completely still at the chessboard, both hands flat on the table. Nobody filled the silence with something easier, because there wasn't anything easier to put in it. And they were 15, and 14, and 15, and they had reached the particular point in a very difficult situation where the most honest thing is to be present in it together without resolving anything. After a while, Ron said, "What do you need from us?" Harry thought about it. "Just this," he said. "Just now." Late that night, alone in the dormitory, he lay on his bed and took stock of what he knew. He was 14 years old. He was carrying the remnant of a soul that wasn't his, suppression bindings placed on him as an infant, and the knowledge that the most powerful wizard in Britain had known about the worst of it for longer than Harry had been able to tie his own shoes. He had not chosen any of this. He had not consented to any of it. He made a decision he did not tell anyone about. It was not heroic. It had nothing performative in it. It was simply this. He would go into whatever was coming, knowing what he was. He would not pretend the tether wasn't there, or that Dumbledore's silences had been anything other than what they were. He would face it open-eyed. The private kind of decision was the only kind worth making. The announced kind was for other people. Bill's letter came 3 weeks later, at the beginning of June. He wrote, "I've done everything I know how to do. 3 more suppression bindings will probably not survive the maze. After that, you'll be running at roughly your natural capacity for the first time in your life, or close to it. Whatever happens in there, whatever you meet, you are more than what Dumbledore counted on. I need you to know that before you go in." Harry read it in the last light coming through the dormitory window, the June evening going amber and long. He folded the letter. He put it in the drawer beside his bed where he kept Sirius's letters, the ones that mattered. The third task was a week away. He was ready, which was not the same as not being afraid, but was the thing you had instead. The champions lined up at the entrance to the maze, and Harry was last, the 4th champion, the one who shouldn't be here, which was true in a way that had been true all year, and was still true now and still didn't matter, because the goblet had chosen him, and the contract was binding, and here he was. He could feel his magic more clearly than he had ever felt it. That was the strange gift of the year. Not the knowledge about the bindings, which was useful, but not comfortable, and not the partial unblocking, which was useful and often frightening, but this, the simple clarity of it. A reservoir larger than he had known was available, still partially capped, but there in a way it had never been before August. He knew where it was. He knew how to reach it. He knew, with Bill's letter folded in the drawer beside his bed, that 3 more suppression bindings would probably not survive the maze's conditions. His scar was alive. Not painful. Alive, the way a bruise is alive when you press it. A low, constant awareness that something was wrong at that precise location, and had been for 14 years, and was about to get considerably more specific about what kind of wrong it was. The dark tether pulled. It had gone directionless in the last 24 hours, no longer pointing north and east, no longer oriented toward Pettigrew's patient preparations. Just motion. Something at the other end that had woken all the way up and was walking toward a door. The cannon fired. Harry entered the maze. The hedges closed behind him almost immediately, the path narrowing to darkness. His enhanced magical sensitivity settled in around him like a second set of senses. The maze's spells registering as pressure before they resolved visually. The enchanted hedges giving off a steady hum of maintained boundary magic he could navigate by almost the way you navigate by temperature. He moved faster than he would have in August. Faster, probably, than the tournament designers had accounted for in a 14-year-old. He heard the blast-ended scroot before he saw it. A scraping drag along the hedge, the heat of its fire-producing end radiating ahead of its body. He stepped sideways into a gap, let it pass, redirected with a reductor curse that cleared the path. The spell came clean and quick. The gap in that particular binding had been open for months. Somewhere in the next turn he felt the first binding fall. It was not a dramatic sensation. He had been expecting drama. Bill's scan notes had described the suppression bindings as compressed structures, as things that would release like tension in a rope. What it actually felt like was a breath, a long, slow exhalation somewhere in the center of his chest, as though something that had been held for years had simply decided not to hold anymore. He stumbled, caught the hedge with one hand, kept moving. The maze didn't stop for internal revelations. The boggart was at a junction. He felt its magical signature as a wrongness that had a shape, the specific signature of something that fed on the observer rather than being observed. He was braced for it. When it resolved into the form it always resolved into for him. The Dementor, the cold, the sound of his mother's voice. He was ready with the ridiculous and the laugh, which this year sounded slightly different than it had in third year, slightly more grounded. The boggart shrank and spun and dissipated. He moved on. The Sphinx was at the next major junction, crouched in the center of a wider clearing where the hedges fell back on both sides. She was magnificent in the specific way of things that have no particular interest in being seen as magnificent. Massive, still, her lion's body and her woman's face regarding him with ancient patience. She spoke the riddle. He listened. His mind worked faster than it had in August, too. The partial unblocking had not been selective, had not given him stronger magic, and the same everything else. The concentration had sharpened along with it, the ability to hold multiple things at once, and the riddle's parts resolved in order into their components, and then assembled. Spider. He said it. The Sphinx bowed her head. She stepped aside. The 2 remaining bindings fell as he crossed the threshold of the Sphinx's junction into the maze beyond. They went together, or near enough, a double exhalation, one and then one, staggered by seconds, and the sensation was so marked that he stopped moving for the length of 3 breaths, one hand on the hedge, while the magical landscape of his own body rearranged itself around the change. He was running at something close to his natural capacity for the first time in his conscious life. It was not overwhelming in the way he might have expected. It was simply available. a fullness where there had been gauze and membrane and constraint. He had been breathing through cloth for 14 years, and he had not known it, and now the cloth was mostly gone, and the air tasted like itself. He kept moving. The giant spider was enormous and fast, and he killed it with a spell that came out harder than he had intended, harder than the same spell would have come out 6 months ago, and spent a fraction of a second adjusting for the difference before the path cleared, and he was running again. The clearing at the maze's center was sudden after the tightness of the hedges. A wide, circular space, the grass flat and silver in the night, and at the center of it, the Triwizard Cup on its plinth, glowing faint blue. Cedric was already there. He was standing 15 feet from the cup, breathing hard, his Hufflepuff robes mud-streaked and his wand out. And he looked at Harry with the expression of someone who had not expected to have to share this clearing. Relief and wariness, and a kind of genuine competitive decency that was, Harry thought, very specifically, Cedric Diggory. They had spent a year occupying adjacent orbits in Hogwarts. They were not close. They had not needed to be. But Harry knew his face. Cedric said, "You made it." "So did you," Harry said. They looked at each other across the clearing. The cup glowed between them. One of them had to take it, or both of them together. Cedric knew the rules as well as Harry did, and the rules said nothing prevented them from taking it at the same moment. And they had both understood this without discussing it. Harry looked at the cup. His curse-breaker sensitivity, the changed perception he had been developing since August, the ability to feel magic in objects and spaces before engaging with them directly, registered the cup differently than a normal enchanted object should register. It was over-enchanted, layered with workings that had nothing to do with a tournament prize. He had felt this once before in his life, on a much smaller scale, and it had been Bill's hands going still in the Burrow garden, and his voice saying, "Give me tonight." He said, "Don't touch it." Cedric looked at him. "What?" "The cup. Don't touch it." The words came fast, because the instinct was faster than the explanation, and he had not yet assembled the explanation into language. Something is wrong with it. The enchantments aren't right. It's not just a cup." Cedric was 17 years old. He had navigated a maze full of things trying to kill him. He had arrived at this clearing legitimately, through his own considerable skill, and the prize was 15 feet away. He looked at Harry with the careful expression of someone assessing whether the person speaking is afraid or is right. Harry reached for his arm. He did not get there in time. Cedric's hand closed on the cup's handle, the same moment Harry's hand closed on Cedric's wrist, the contact simultaneous, and the portkey activated. The hook behind the navel, the violent sideways pull, the maze disappearing. They arrived in darkness and cold on damp grass over old packed earth, and Harry already knew where they were, not because he recognized it, but because the tether blazed. It had been pulling for months, had been directional, and then purposeful, and then urgent. And now it went from urgent to screaming, because what was at the other end of it was here, 3 meters away, being carried in the arms of a small, hunched figure between the tombstones. The graveyard, ancient yew tree against the sky. Tombstones leaning at their various angles, like an interrupted conversation. A large stone cauldron, dark metal, sitting on the ground between 2 graves. And Wormtail, Pettigrew, moving toward it with something bundled in his arms that registered to Harry's fully open perception as wrongness concentrated, as intention and malice and diminished life compacted into a rudimental form. The tether connecting Harry to that form pulled taut enough that he felt it in his chest like a physical thing. Cedric had stumbled on the landing and righted himself, and was standing beside Harry now, his wand out, taking in the tombstones and the cauldron and Pettigrew, and the thing in Pettigrew's arms. He said, "Harry, what is this place?" A cold voice said, "Kill the spare." The cold voice said, "Kill the spare," and Harry's magic moved before his mind did. He had approximately half a second. He knew this the way he knew things in the air on a firebolt, not as thought, but as geometry, the body calculating faster than language. Wormtail had turned toward Cedric. The wand was rising. He did not cast a spell. He had no time to form an incantation. His magic erupted outward, raw and unformed, moving on the purest available impulse, which was this: not him, not Cedric. The magic caught the curse sideways, not a block, not a shield, a deflection, the way a thrown stone deflects off a moving surface rather than a stationary one. The energy redirected rather than absorbed. The killing curse hit Cedric at an angle it was not designed to be a killing curse at. The green light scattered. Cedric went down. The 3 remaining suppression bindings shattered simultaneously under the output. Harry felt them go. 3 concussions in the center of his chest, one after another, and then nothing between him and his own magic except himself. Wormtail moved. Harry was wandless. The binding came fast. He was lashed to a tombstone, his wand somewhere in the grass beyond reach, his arms behind him, and the stone cold against his spine. The dark tether was deafening. It had been building all year, from a low pull to a direction, to an urgency, to a scream, and now, with the thing in Wormtail's arms 3 feet away and being lowered into the cauldron, it reached a frequency that had no analogue in anything Harry had felt before. The soul fragment in his scar was recognizing its source. Wormtail's voice was high and reverent and shaking. Bone of the father, unknowingly given. The ground cracked open beside the tombstone, and something rose from the earth. Flesh of the servant, willingly given. The silver hand closed on Wormtail's own wrist, and he did not scream, which cost him something. The hand fell. The cauldron's fluid turned from clear to dark. Blood of the enemy, forcibly taken. The knife, Harry's arm, the blood that ran from the cut and into the cauldron, was not the blood of a suppressed 14-year-old. It was the blood of one running at his native capacity for the first time, carrying Lily Potter's sacrificial protection at full unsuppressed potency, and Harry felt the difference as a draining that went deeper than volume. The cauldron blazed white. The fluid boiled and roiled and rose. Voldemort rose from it. He was tall and white, and wrong in the way that things assembled rather than grown are wrong. The red eyes, the flat plane of the face, the hands like pale spiders opening in the night air. He stood in the graveyard and breathed for the first time in 13 years. Harry watched the exact moment Voldemort registered something he had not been expecting. He went still. He looked at his hands. He was processing the blood. The sacrificial protection Lily Potter had left in Harry, carried now in Voldemort's veins, at a magnitude the ritual had never encountered. He said, "More interesting than expected." He crossed the graveyard. The Death Eaters in the darkness did not move. Voldemort looked at Harry with his red eyes, and the expression in them was assessment rather than triumph, which was more frightening. The tether between them pulled in both directions. The Horcrux soul fragment was reacting to its source being embodied for the first time since the night Harry's parents died. It was extraordinary pain. Harry did not scream. Behind Voldemort's shoulder, in the shadows between two tombstones, something moved. Cedric was not dead. He was on the ground, and he was badly hurt. Harry could not see the extent of it from the tombstone, but he was moving. He was reaching for something in the grass. Wormtail had dropped his wand when the ritual required both his hands, and the wand had fallen somewhere between Cedric's body and the cauldron, and Cedric's fingers were closing on it. Voldemort had not turned. He was looking at Harry. Harry kept his eyes on Voldemort's face. The duel began because it had to. Voldemort untied Harry and returned his wand with the theatricality of someone who does not believe the advantage matters. He was correct that the advantage barely mattered. He was wrong about how much. Harry's wand and Voldemort's wand held cores from the same phoenix. He had known this since Ollivander's wondering voice in a lit shop. He knew what happened when they were forced into combat. The golden web came from both ends simultaneously. It was a connection rather than an impact, the two cores refusing to fight each other, insisting instead on resonance, the air between them filling with gold. Harry gripped his wand with both hands and held. The tether was visible. That was not something Bill had described, perhaps not something he could have anticipated. The priori incantatem effect had caught the dark tether in the web, and Harry could see it as a cord of dark light running through the gold, thinner and colder than everything around it. He could not sever it. He could only look at it and know it for what it was. The echoes came. In the canon of his life, as it should have been, the first echo would have been Cedric Diggory. Harry knew this without knowing how he knew it from some quality of the web's silence at the place where that echo should have appeared, and did not. There was a gap in the sequence, an absence, a breath-shaped space where a 17-year-old boy was not. Then the echo came, and it was an old man's voice, weather-worn and confused, saying, "I don't know what happened," over and over, and fading into whatever came after. Frank Bryce. And behind him, a woman's voice, fragmented and drifting, that had been fragmented for longer. Bertha Jorkins, who had not been herself in a long time before she died. And then two voices Harry had heard in other contexts, in a mirror's depths, in a photograph on a mantelpiece, in the specific silences adults left around the subject of his parents. His mother's voice first, and then his father's. They were not speaking to him, not exactly. They were the echoes of spells, not people. But they were close enough to people that he could hold the weight of them without breaking. He listened. He held the web. He breathed. No Cedric. He was alive. The gap confirmed it in real time. The web showed him the reverse order of Voldemort's murders, and the absence of Cedric Diggory in that sequence meant Cedric Diggory was not among them. Harry broke the web. He ran for Cedric, who was upright, barely, holding Wormtail's wand in one hand and one arm against a tombstone for support. Harry's shout was already leaving him before he consciously decided to shout, "The cup! The portkey! Touch the cup!" Cedric didn't ask. That was the thing about Cedric that Harry had been learning all year, at a respectful, competitive distance, and now learned all at once. He did not waste time on questions when the person shouting at him had just survived what Harry had just survived. He pushed off the tombstone and moved toward the Triwizard Cup, lying in the grass where it had fallen. And Harry reached him, and they each closed a hand on it at the same moment. Cedric's borrowed and Harry's own, and the hook behind the navel and the violent sideways pull and the graveyard dissolved. They landed on the Hogwarts grounds, in a heap on the grass in front of the maze entrance, in the light from the arena torches, in front of the crowd that had been waiting for two champions and was now receiving them. Harry heard the crowd go silent first and then erupt, which was the opposite order of what he'd expected. But he was on his knees on the Hogwarts grass, and the night air was warmer than the graveyard air, and he was taking inventory. Scar, tether, limbs, wand still in hand. The tether was still live but quiet, the way it had been quiet when Voldemort was distant. Voldemort was distant now. He was restored and embodied, and in a graveyard in a part of England Harry didn't know the name of. And Harry was here, on the grass, and Cedric was beside him, breathing. Cedric was breathing. Harry became aware of Dumbledore crossing the grounds toward them, moving with the long-legged urgency that his usual unhurried manner obscured, moving the way a man moves when he has already calculated 3 scenarios and is running toward the one he hopes it is. He arrived. He crouched. He looked at Cedric, who was bleeding and alive, and looking back at him. Then he looked at Harry's face. He read it the way he had always read things, completely, in a moment. Harry did not look away. He let Dumbledore see what was there, the tether still pulling, the missing echo in the web's sequence, the knowledge of everything he had been carrying, and the fact that he had carried it here and come back. Dumbledore put his hand on Harry's shoulder. He said nothing. Harry could feel the weight of what the year had been in that hand, what Bill had started in the Burrow garden, what it had cost and what it had produced. 2 champions, both alive. Cedric was in the bed next to Harry's. This was the fact that changed everything. Not the testimony. Testimony could be managed, could be shaped, could be treated as the confused report of a 14-year-old who had been through something terrible. Not even 2 testimonies. But Cedric Diggory was the Hufflepuff champion, and he was 17 years old, and he was lying in the hospital wing with wounds that were consistent with what Harry had described, and when the hospital matron, and then Dumbledore, and then Cedric's father came to his bedside, Cedric told them the same story Harry had told, in the same order, with the same names. The wizarding world could not manage this the way it had managed other things. Barty Crouch Jr.'s exposure followed in the sequence that these things follow, when 2 coherent witnesses have already established the shape of events. The false Moody was unmasked, the polyjuice potion traced, the real Alastair Moody found in a trunk. Snape provided Veritaserum. The confession was extracted. Cornelius Fudge arrived at Hogwarts and refused to accept the conclusion and sent the Dementor for Crouch Jr. before anyone could stop him, which was a disaster in its own right, a man's memories and testimony gone. But even Fudge could not make the Hufflepuff champion's account disappear, and he knew it, and the Ministry's deniability began collapsing before the month was out. Harry slept for a day. He woke to the sound of Cedric breathing across the ward and lay looking at the ceiling for a long time. The tether was quiet. It would not be quiet forever. Dumbledore came on the 2nd evening, alone, and sat in the chair beside Harry's bed. He set his half-moon spectacles on his knee and did not put them back on. He gave Harry the conversation they should have had years ago. Harry did not need Dumbledore to explain Voldemort's return. He had been there, had felt it happen through the tether in his chest, had watched the white hands open in the graveyard air. What Harry needed was the accounting. Which of the 17 bindings had been Dumbledore's choice, and why, and what the dark tether was in specific terms, and what removing it might eventually require. Dumbledore named them. He named them in the same order Bill had classified them, which was the order of their placement. The bond of blood first, the 9 suppression bindings next, and then the tether last. He explained the suppression bindings with the particular quality of a man who has rehearsed the explanation for years, and is now discovering that preparation doesn't make it easier to give. He had been afraid of the power Harry was likely to develop. He had made a choice he believed was protective. He had not asked. He hadn't, then or in any of the years since, told Harry. He said, "I am sorry," at the end of it. 2 words. Very quiet. Harry looked at him and found that the anger he had been carrying since the Burrow garden had not disappeared, but had settled into something more navigable. Not forgiveness. Not yet. but the beginning of the process that would get there eventually. When there was more time and fewer urgent things in the way, he said, "I know." Bill arrived the following morning and ran the final scan. 9 suppression bindings. Gone. All 9 collapsed across the first task and the second, and the maze and the graveyard, none remaining. The protective enchantments intact, Lily's sacrificial magic, and the bond of blood, and the trace, all holding. The killing curse, residue in the scar intact, the soul fragment, and the borrowed parcel tongue intact. The tether, changed, altered by the unsuppressed blood that now ran in Voldemort's restored veins, stressed by the priori incantatem in a way that had no precedent in Bill's classification notes, but present. Still present. 8 bindings. Not 17. Not none. Bill closed his notebook. He said, "You're running at your natural capacity. The 8 that remain, the protective ones, the administrative ones, the dark ones, most of those I can't remove safely. Some of them we shouldn't remove. The bond of blood keeps you safer than anything else I know how to build." Harry said, "And the dark tether?" Bill said, "That one waits. I don't know what for." He paused. "But I know what you are when you're not capped, Harry. Whatever enough turns out to mean. It's enough." Arthur and Molly arrived that afternoon with the particular efficiency of parents who have been told their child is in a hospital wing and have organized themselves around the central fact that they are going immediately and will sort out everything else after. Arthur moved through the ward to Harry's bed with the steady purpose of a man who is not leaving without all of his children, biological and otherwise. Molly said very little. She sat beside Harry and put her hand over his on the blanket and held it there for a long time without speaking, which said everything. Fred and George and Ron and Ginny filled the doorway. It was a very large amount of Weasley. It was enough. Arthur crossed to where Dumbledore was standing near the window and said quietly, "We'll be taking Harry home for the summer." A statement, not a question, and not a request. Dumbledore said, "Of course." He looked out the window. The June grounds were bright through the glass. On the platform, the morning of the Hogwarts Express, Bill stood in the steam and watched the students stream past with their trunks. He had his classification journal with him. He had taken a page from it, the page that listed the 8 remaining bindings in his careful, field notation handwriting, with their categories and their functions, and the notes he'd made across the year of watching them shift and loosen. He had folded it into quarters. Harry came through the crowd with Ron at his shoulder and the particular look on his face that he'd had since the hospital wing. Not healed, not unburdened, but oriented. Pointed in a direction he'd chosen. Bill held out the page. Harry took it and looked at it and put it in his pocket. Bill said, "We're going to take them off, one at a time, together." Harry looked at him for a moment. The platform noise moved around them. Then he nodded, once, the nod of someone who has decided to believe a thing is possible and is choosing to proceed on that basis, and boarded the train. Bill watched him go. Ron followed. Hermione was already visible through a window, books arranged on the seat beside her. Ginny appeared at another window a moment later and waved down at the platform. The whistle sounded. The steam thickened. Bill had spent 3 years in Egypt reading layered enchantments off objects that had been sealed for centuries, and he had learned that the most important question was not what was on an artifact, but what was underneath, what the object was without its accumulation. He had found Harry Potter in the Burrow garden on a summer evening, and read him the same way, and what he had found beneath the 17 was not what he had expected to find, and not what anyone had told him would be there. The train pulled away from the platform. In the years that Harry had been at Hogwarts, he had returned to Privet Drive every summer alone. He had left King's Cross on an empty seat in an empty compartment, heading toward a house where the best he could hope for was to be ignored. That was the story. That was the version that had run, unchanged, for 4 years. The page in Harry's pocket listed 8 bindings. 17 less 9. Only 8. And someone who knew how to read them, and a family that had looked at what Harry was carrying and said, "We'll be taking him home." The train moved south through